When Edward the Confessor died in the first week of 1066, the crown of England faced an uncertain future. Whilst the first major event following the old king's death, the crowning of Harold Godwinson, was fairly predictable, the long term outlook was much more up in the air, as rival claims challenging Harold could be found in England, Normandy, and Norway. But what had Edward the Confessor planned for the succession, if indeed he had planned anything at all? Edward had, of course, died childless. Why this was the case is up for debate. It has been speculated that Edward died without issue because of medical reasons, whilst it is also possible that the king's religious devotion was the chief factor for no heir being forthcoming. It's also been suggested that Edward simply refused to sire any children with his wife Edith, who was a daughter of the powerful Earl Godwin. Resentful of the over-mighty Earl, it's said that Edward abstained from producing an heir in order to stop the Godwin family from getting their hands on the throne. If this theory is correct, it goes without saying that Edward would have ruled out Harold, Godwin's son of course, and the king's brother-in-law, ever becoming king as well. Given the apparent uncertainty of the succession right up until Edward's death, and the fact that Harold was still in a position to take the crown, it seems to me that this theory of Edward not producing a son with his wife because of bitterness for the Godwins is wrong. Harold, after his father died in 1053, became the most powerful man in England and a natural contender for the throne. In the 1050s, Edward had an opportunity to rule the Godwin family out of the equation entirely. In 1051, he was visited by William, Duke of Normandy. According to the Normans, William was promised the throne by Edward, who had apparently come to terms with the fact that he would have no son of his own to succeed him. Edward, a son of Emma of Normandy and Athelred the Unready, had spent decades in exile in Normandy following Athelred's brief deposition between late 1013 and early 1014, and perhaps formed a bond with his Norman kinsman. In 1036, Edward and his brother Alfred returned to England, only to be attacked by the men of Earl Godwin, acting on behalf of King Harold Harefoot, with Alfred being viciously blinded and dying from his injuries. Whilst Edward may have escaped, resentment at Godwin must surely have remained with him. At this point, it may well look as though Edward's choice was obvious. Why would he side with the Godwins after his brother's brutal murder, and not with Duke William, when Normandy, the homeland of his own mother, had provided him with sanctuary during dark and troubled times? But for Edward, there was another option. This was his nephew, Edward the Exile. Edward the Exile, a son of Edmund Ironside, had, as a young child, a lucky escape. King Canute, seeing him as a threat, wanted him dead, but didn't want to carry out the dreadful deed himself, and ordered the King of Sweden to murder Edward and his brother, another Edmund. The Swedish king refused, and Edward and Edmund survived, residing in Hungary, where Edward's children were born and Edmund would die. And in 1057, Edward the Confessor invited his nephew to return to England. This to me indicates that the king, whatever he had told Duke William 6 years earlier, was not binding, at least as the king himself viewed it. In all likelihood, stories of Edward the Confessor promising William the throne were figments of Norman propaganda. Another possibility is that the king had assumed that Edward the Exile was dead, and receiving word that his nephew was in fact alive, changed his plans for the succession. But soon after Edward the Exile had arrived in England, he died. He had brought with him his family, including a 5-year-old son named Edgar, but it is unlikely that Edward the Confessor saw Edgar as a likely candidate to succeed him. However, there is no doubt, given Edgar's ties to the English crown, he was, in fact, the rightful claimant in 1066, but given he was still only 14, he was always likely to be pushed to one side by more experienced men. With Edward the Exile's death, Edward the Confessor's plans were once more up in the air. With Edward the Confessor's death in early January of 1066, the old king had left behind a political situation that was very unclear indeed, even with the rapid coronation of Harold Godwinson. Harold himself, Duke William of Normandy, Harold Hardrada of Norway, and young Edgar Atheling all saw an opportunity to become King of England, with it mattering little to the three older men of the righteousness of their claims. And it was Harold Godwinson who had made the first move. In the end, it may be, as Edward the Confessor lay dying, he had looked at Harold Godwinson with weary eyes, and accepted that it would be his brother-in-law who would become king. But by that point it was now inconsequential what Edward thought. Harold, ignoring any oath that he was said to have made to Duke William of Normandy, swooped in and took the crown. Was this what Edward the Confessor had wanted? It's hard to say now, but it seems to me that the king hadn't really known what he had wanted all along, and his dithering had triggered one of the most monumental years in English history.